Ladies and gentlemen, you've all been waiting for this. It's another reaction to Vivek Ramaswamy.
So if I were on the board of a university, and I'm not currently on the board of a university, I think it would be financially irresponsible if you weren't setting aside some reserve for litigation right now. And I think that's going to be a good thing in disciplining as a function these universities that have engaged in systematic discrimination of a kind that history will judge very poorly. It is an ugly form of discrimination. Not that different. In Harvard, it's my alma mater, so I'll be gloves off in my criticism. What they did to Jews 50 years ago that they'll apologize for today, that is what they're doing actively today. The effect is on Asian Americans. History will not judge that kindly. And I think that's going to come with real legal teeth and consequences. And their, accountability, I think, is a precondition for justice.
My own criticisms of Harvard go beyond just the affirmative action issue being discussed here. My fiance works as a research technician, not at Harvard. She was telling me some stories from other people in her lab, revealing to her how when a lab at Harvard applies for grant money and receives that grant money, the lab only gets around 10%, and 90% of that money goes to Harvard's endowment. So the purposes of the grant, the project that the grant is designed to tackle, only gets a tiny percentage. 90% of that money is taken by Harvard, presumably to pay their very wealthy administrators. So I have many, many problems about these elite, corrupt institutions and how they have been exploiting individuals, not just students, but also people embedded inside the university.
So I hope, actually, I'm rooting for a form of creative destruction here, that this unleashes a wave of, and you want to do the math on this, these liabilities can be quite uncapped, that actually financially punish universities for engaging in the kinds of behaviors they have. That financial accountability then triggers revealing the way in which the entire system was based actually on a large farce of the value and the inflated value and subsidized value, artificially subsidized value for your college education, that really delivers a much needed reckoning to higher education itself. That's what I'm rooting for, and I can tell you, I'm not just going to be passively rooting for it. In whatever capacity I'm in, 2 years from now, I think that there's ways we can use this finally to deliver the wake-up call to fixing a broken higher education system in this country.
Yes, it does seem that, it's been an enormous boon to the HR departments, all of this.
Of course it is.
Stanford, which had such a fine reputation until recent weeks, Stanford, it turned out there is roughly one HR person on staff, on faculty, for every student. It would be cheaper to get everyone a butler. And much more useful. And it would make me want to go to Stanford.
These universities are already 4-year vacations. Why not spice up the deal a little bit?
But one of the great scandals that has to be addressed in this country is how you have people coming out of university in ever more debt, paying for these vast bureaucracies of bureaucrats, and every year, year on year, being stupider and stupider. Something has to give at some point, does it not?
It does. I think you've put your finger on the right pulse. It is not an accident that this correlates with rise in college tuition, actually.
Yeah.
So in Woke Inc., my first book, I cited this at Michigan State, but may as well have been many other universities too. There's been an order of magnitude, so 10x explosion in the ratio of administrative staff to students. And so the rise of this managerial bureaucracy is part of what creates this anti-meritocratic force in all of our institutions, by the way.
Just want to add that on my Gestalt Productions channel, my main channel, I have a video coming out pretty soon, hopefully within the next few weeks, about academia, not just the administrative bloat, also the religious nature of the ideology that these institutions are pushing. In my mind, higher education is something that is begging to be disrupted, and certain puzzle pieces have already started being put in place. Online education has absolutely exploded. Artificial intelligence and tools like ChatGPT, I get into this in my video as well, are making university assignments obsolete. It's going to be increasingly difficult as this decade progresses to discern whether students are handing in original work. That is a disaster for these universities. How do we fix that? How do we establish a new system of credentials that isn't so politically motivated and completely shattered by 21st century developments? That's another very difficult question. Given that the universities are mostly possessed by left-wing ideologues at this stage, it's going to be more and more important that a new left emerges in the establishment of new educational institutions. Because if the right is, understandably, trying to construct new forms of higher education, that potentially will leave out very essential voices. The left has done so much damage to all left-wing values, even ones that might be reasonable, that it's going to be important for a reasonable segment of the left to insert themselves into this conversation. I hope to be able to insert myself in this conversation as well.
Well, what does that mean? We've created the very conditions then for viewpoint discrimination while leaving political expression itself unprotected. And so these concepts between the assault on free speech, which itself is part of a meritocracy of ideas, is actually deeply related to the assault on merit in hiring itself, and the managerial bureaucracy that administers the latter is actually responsible for creating the anti-speech conditions in the former. And so it's not an accident. People wonder, why do we see these malaises rise at the same time? You think free speech culture assault and cancel culture is over here, and anti-meritocratic stuff and affirmative action and DEI bureaucracies are over here. No. It's not a coincidence. These are deeply linked, and if we get to that root cause with an affirmative alternative vision of our own, then we can stand on strong moral and principled footing to not only gut that system, but create a new one to take its place.
Let me lead us on to what's perhaps one of the most awkward parts of this conversation, which is we talk most of the time in discussions about meritocracy about the people who can and the people who can succeed. Of course, in any society, but particularly in a democracy like America, you have a flip side of that problem. You said, I was very struck by it, hardship is not the same thing as victimhood. I couldn't agree more, but we do live in a society in which victimhood is the main goal. To be a victim and to be on the victim hierarchy, to have the delicious opportunity to be the most victimized person is clearly the aspiration. We've all seen it in our lives.
I'm going to point this out because I know I have a large conservative audience watching the channel. Mostly in these kinds of discussions between two more right-leaning individuals talking about victimhood, there is allusion to people on the left being inclined to label themselves as victims. I think this tendency takes place on the right as well. I think it's a universal problem. I think human beings have an inherent desire to label themselves as victims because it reduces the accountability they have to take. If I haven't made it clear on this channel, I am not a fan of Donald Trump. I believe that the way Donald Trump himself has talked about losing the election is a form of embracing victimhood. Constantly talking about how I was the victim of a stolen election. Hillary Clinton did the same thing, and the right rightfully called her out on it. But unfortunately, the right wing has a difficult time calling out its own as well. And so I think conservatives should pay attention to that, because it makes you guys look like hypocrites. Another one of my videos, conservatives are hypocrites. Everybody is a hypocrite because we solely want to favor our own side. You're going to seem much more legitimate from an outside perspective when you are willing to call out the crap on your own team.
People pick up the microphone in a Q&A and they say, speaking as, and I think, everything that's going to come afterwards is going to be garbage. And then they'll say something about their lived experience, as if there's any other kind of experience. Sort of, in my unlived experience. But we do have this problem, particularly in America, that the seeking of victimhood in our own lifetimes, and you wrote about this obviously in both of your books, but in our own lifetimes, we've moved, in America in particular, which is so striking, from a culture of heroism to a culture of victimhood. I used rather carefully Nietzsche's work on the genealogy of morals in my last book, and there's one particular insight of his that really struck me and is pertinent to our situation and to our discussion today, which is this. Nietzsche talks about the type of person who, among other things, tears, he says, at wounds long since healed and then cries about their hurt. Now, Nietzsche says there's one particular problem, which is that the person of resentment needs somebody to stand over their lives and make a correction, but it's not even clear to Nietzsche who that person should be. He says that somebody must stand over the life of the person of resentment and say to them at some point, "You are right. You have reason to be resentful. There is somebody who has ruined your life. There is somebody who has held you back. The person is you." Now, that is probably the least pleasant thing to hear, and probably one of the hardest things to ever say. How can a politician?
It's also quite presumptuous, depending on your relationship with the patient themselves. How could you know so much information about an individual to be so certain that it was them who laid the groundwork for the victimization of their entire life? And in terms of whose responsibility that actually is, speaking as someone with a psychological background, has interest in opening up a therapeutic practice of some kind at a point, at least based on what I'm familiar with, it is not the role of a therapist to pose such a confrontational statement. Oftentimes, when dealing with patients, it's a lot more effective to ask a series of questions, inquisitive questions, to get to know somebody and enable them to make discoveries about their own lives and trajectories. So to sort of respond to Douglas there, in many ways I think it is contingent upon the individual themselves to come to that realization. But perhaps that's wishful thinking. People won't respond to criticism that is so biting if they are not ready to receive such criticism.
Should a politician say to certain people, "You know, you have screwed up your life, and it's been your responsibility and your fault. You could turn it around, but if you don't want to, you'll still be the only person to blame"?
I think here's how I would say it. It is still in your power to turn it around, but that is your choice to make. I think hardship is not a choice.
Unless you don't believe in free will. Oh, philosophical mic drop.
Best a politician can do, certainly a president can do, is at least to create the conditions in a country where we don't create the incentives for people to choose victimhood. And so would I, if I'm speaking as a national leader here, would I point to the person and say it is your fault? I would say it the other way. I think it is our fault for creating a culture, including the economic incentives that backstop it, for you to make the choice that you are making today, to be a victim rather than to be a victor.
In terms of how we go about doing that, I will bring this up at whatever chance I get, because it is what Gestalt Productions is all about. But I am looking to promote the idea that we should combine psychedelic-assisted therapy and universal basic income. I think we should be paying people to seek out psychedelic-assisted treatment when that time comes. In future videos, I will break down the economic logistics of this plan, how something like that can be paid for, etc., etc. What I really like about this opportunity to infuse an incentive with the psychedelic experience is that an inherent component of taking a psychedelic for so many is to go on a journey, in many cases, a heroic journey, a journey that puts you through hardship, a journey that gives you an opportunity to grow. And for people who have never been confronted with that experience, it might be difficult to understand. But in terms of flipping our societal narrative from one of victimhood to one of heroism, I think there needs to be a radical transformation in how we incentivize heroism. To me, psychedelics offer a great portal, but it's a tricky path, one that's easy to abuse one that needs to be taken responsibly.
And I think that is the kernel, thank you, for a national revival in this country. I think it makes the difference. That single trade will make the difference of whether we are Rome, or more likely, look at how long we've been alive as a country, more likely whether we are Carthage, or whether we're just a little young, going through our version of adolescence. Adolescence is a period where, even absent those government incentives, there's something about adolescence that makes you want to see yourself as a victim of your parents, of your conditions.
Another crucial part of adolescence I can't resist is rebellion, or rebelling against the old order to forge a new identity. And perhaps what could represent a greater token of rebellion than the mass acceptance of a psychedelic movement? Talk about rebelling against the old way of doing things. If we want to establish new identity, a new cultural identity that's rich in purpose and meaning, with a connection to spirituality, to me, this is the path. But it has to be driven from all political sides. It can't be a left-wing thing. It can't be a right-wing thing. It needs to be an anti-establishment, pro-human, economically informed, wise set of initiatives led by intelligent people with strong moral backbones. That's all we can really hope for.
Your high school peers, right? There's something about this is woven into nature too. It's not just a governmental citizenry relationship. It's something within each of us. Well, we're going through that version of adolescence as a nation right now. And I think in the good version of this, where we have leaders that are willing to change that incentive structure and to boldly look their citizenry in the eye and speak that hard truth back to them, set the expectation of what we expect of citizens. The idea of being a citizen entailing a duty. Part of that duty is to look within, not to blame the other, but ask about what I can do myself. Well, if we're able to do that, then I think as a nation itself, we will too get through our version of adolescence and be stronger on the other side of it. As there were many rises and many falls of Rome, actually, that's one of the secrets of history. There was no one rise and fall of Rome. There were many rises and many falls. I think we may still be ahead of the next rise in the American experiment. I truly believe that. I think it depends on the leaders who we have who are willing to speak that hard truth.
I'm so glad that you said that about adolescence in America. It comes much better from your mouth than from mine.
To get back on a more serious note here, a lot of people have a very grim view of where we are right now as a country and what the future holds. Are we at the turn or the inflection point of some historical cycle that is inevitably leading us toward civil unrest and rebellion? Many parallels have been drawn between the exact moment that we are at right now and the French Revolution. And there is a belief from some that the path there is imminent. A statement as trite as echo chambers are bad is hardly a solution. But if we are really committed to addressing this issue of echo chambers, I think the only way to do so is to seek information directly outside the echo chamber with an open mind. And even when those people who don't agree with you aren't acting in good faith, you still try to hear them out anyway. You give your opponents every benefit of the doubt, even when they don't deserve it. Politicians and political leaders can play their games, posturing in the perfect way as to not lose their leverage. But as citizens, we don't have to play these political games.
I was brought up to believe, as Jessica Mitford once said, we weren't taught much about American history in Britain. What we were taught was that basically the Americans had done something unspeakable in the 18th century, and we preferred not to talk about it. Very embarrassing for them. But let me just, two points that we really should hit on before we wrap up. The first, let me bring us onto a sort of metaphysical point before I bring us onto a more practical one. Metaphysical point is this. You mentioned the issue of free speech a couple of times. It seems to me that the great problem that exists in that regard in America is that we've lost confidence in the idea that free speech leads to truth.
Yes.
Because we've lost the idea of truth. We've lost the idea that this battle of ideas, this knocking of stone on flint refines things.
And I gotta tell ya, it ain't gonna get easier from here. Dealing with all of these deep fakes Not just the social media algorithms themselves, grappling with this notion of fake news or what is fake news, and everybody has their own idea of what's fake and what media manipulation constitutes. But now we're in a situation where people can totally manipulate what you see, totally doctor something that never took place. Where does that place the integrity of our institutions? Most of which, perhaps, is the legal system, when video evidence can no longer be trusted.
But the idea that we need speech, we need inquiry, because we will get to a truth, and that truth exists, seems to be one of the underlying things that has fallen away.
I agree with you. You're right over the flame with truth, actually, and the rejection of truth. Now, I think this puts pressure, helpfully, on the partisan political framework through which we're taught to see the actual divides in this country. Because where you began, Douglas, in your remarks, when you were speaking, was actually on the idea that the left and the right differ on how to achieve a world in which those who are endowed with whatever their talent is are permitted to achieve it. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that, but there's also a strain in this country that rejects that as an objective in its own right, that doesn't disagree about the means but disagrees about the end itself. And so it's actually, though I run for president as a Republican, it's the least important part of it is that label. I think that it puts pressure on us to revise, to update the actual political divide in our country, which is not between Republicans and Democrats. These labels have come out to mean hollowed out husks of themselves. On the left, there's the divide you just talked about. On the right, there's an increasing strain of victimhood itself, right? It's a victimhood culture that's spread in many different directions. Let's for a moment dissolve that distinction and see this through a different lens itself of, the way I'll describe it simply is, are you pro-American or anti-American? But what does that mean? It means, are you pro-truth? Do you believe in the existence of an objective truth? And then we can disagree about the details of how we get there, but do we agree on that basic end, or do we not? And I think that there's a good 20-25% of this country that does not, but at least we can then see that with clarity and smoke that out.
I'm going to add one point here about truth and the nature of it. It's obviously a very philosophical question. People on the right tend to come from the perspective that there is some kind of truth that we can grasp. And there's a growing cultural movement on the left that's perhaps paired with nihilism as well, that there is no objective truth, that truth is, that fateful word, socially constructed, and that all forms of truth, all personal truths, should be held equal. And I do think there's a very interesting conversation to be had about this idea, especially as we investigate the entering into each individual's own digital realm. What will that person's truth represent in the grand ecosystem of humanity? What is humanity becoming? These are all questions. And again, from the right, it's very easy to dismiss these far-fetched notions of truth being fully socially constructed as not worth contending with. My perspective on this is, if you really want to understand left-wing perspectives, better than people on the left understand their own perspectives, you need to go into the postmodern thinkers. You need to read Foucault. You need to read Derrida, if you have the ability to do so. I know that's not something that most people have the time for. This is incredibly dense stuff. I have not gone through it myself. I'm working on it, but one can only do so much. At the very least, that should be an ideal worth striving toward. You need to understand the origins of your political opponents just as much as you need to understand your own positions. That's a message to conservatives. I know Jordan Peterson, he rails against Foucault, he rails against Derrida. These people are horrible. They've led to the destruction of our society, postmodern neo-Marxism at universities. I get all that. One thing that I wish Jordan Peterson would push to the people that listen to him is to go read Foucault, go read Derrida, understand it, and then you can make judgments about it subsequently.
The optimistic note with which I'll end that is, I think that's not a 50-50 divide in this country. That's something like a 75-25, maybe 80-20 divide, which means that if in the conservative movement we make the next election in 2024, like Reagan in some ways did in 1980, about that underlying actual reality, could be a landslide election and probably the most unifying thing we could deliver to a country that's in bad need of it. But that's, I think, the prism. We have to take off the goggles of partisan politics to actually see that reality. That's the real fissure at the heart of the American politic, not some sort of artificial retrofitted partisan distinction.
And that's definitely how Vivek views himself, as someone capable of delivering that Reagan-like landslide election. I think he's right if he gets the opportunity, but that is admittedly optimistic thinking. We'll go over this story at some point as well, because it's a clear jab from the left. But there are certain people who support the former president, who believe, and this is a minority, but there are people who believe that no matter what he does, or no matter what he has done, that he is by default not guilty. People are with him no matter what, no matter who the moral character is living within Donald Trump. I think that's an abhorrent truth. And people on the left are very quick to point out whenever a Trump supporter says, I will support this person even if he commits murder on the front steps of the White House.
We had somebody earlier tell us that if Trump was standing on the steps of the White House and murdered someone, he'd still vote for him. Same with you?
Mm-hmm.
How come?
I don't know. I like Trump. He just got something about him.
People on the left are quick to go after that, and they should be. It's dangerous, and I hope the audience that I'm building with more right-wing leanings can see that. This is specifically to those who support Donald Trump. There are people on your team right now who think this. That should give you pause. That's all I'll say. Thanks for watching this. Very interesting conversation between these two. Great thinkers of our time, and I will be reacting to more Vivek in the future. Take care.